Good morning and welcome. This is Megan Mansfield from Accordant Company. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar from AvidXchange titled Accounts Payable Automation with TimberScan Titanium for Sage Intacct. Our presenter today is Mike Carbino, Senior Product Director at AvidXchange. Before we get started, I want to address a few housekeeping items. Everyone is muted for a clean listening experience. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions box. We will collect the questions and address them at the end of the session. For the best viewing experience, please maximize your screen. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be provided via email. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Megan. Good morning, everyone. So this morning, we are going to explore the accounts payable workflow application called TimberScan Titanium, and it was designed specifically for Sage Intacct. So before we actually get into the application, which we're going to fairly quickly, I just want to walk through a few basic things to kind of set the table, set the stage for what we're going to be looking at, what we're going to be seeing as we get into the application. So first of all, I want to talk about TimberScan Titanium, and I also want to talk about AvidXchange and the Pay Network for just a moment. So TimberScan Titanium, some of you may be familiar, perhaps not, but we actually created a product called TimberScan many years ago, as far back as 2007. And it was designed for Sage 300 CRE. So TimberScan has been a very, very successful AP workflow solution for the construction industry in the Sage 300 CRE space for several years. Perhaps I would say about 7 years ago or so, we decided to create we'll call it the next generation TimberScan called Titanium. And when we designed this, we designed it with the idea, the flexibility of being able to integrate this with other ERP solutions beyond Sage 300 CRE. And lo and behold, a perfect match and marriage for us occurred with Sage Intacct. So we have created the integration from TimberScan Titanium to Sage Intacct, very similar to the way that we integrate TimberScan with Sage 300 CRE. What's nice is that it's a very seamless integration, and I'll show you some of the things that we've done that make it very easy to be able to process because everything is familiar, and it looks and feels and operates in very much the same way as if I were processing transactions within Sage Intacct. However, we've built a lot of additional tools. That said, 3 years ago, AvidXchange acquired the company that developed and created TimberScan in Titanium. And when they did so, basically what happened is that we created a scenario in which we took the best-in-class AP workflow solution, TimberScan and TimberScan Titanium, and we combined that with the leading provider of payment solutions to the middle market. So now what we've done is we've created what we call an entire purchase-to-pay solution. So not only does TimberScan Titanium address the needs of being able to manage that AP workflow process on the front end, to be able to take invoices from the time that they arrive at your door all the way through the approval process, but we also can manage the payments as well and eliminate along the way the need for having to handle paper and create inefficiencies. So with that, this is basically the workflow process that we've built using that idea and that concept of purchase to pay. It starts with the opportunity to be able to acquire the invoices. When they come in, we have different ways, different tools in which we can acquire the invoice, and I'll show you that when we get into the application. Once they've been acquired, they go to what we call initial data entry in Titanium. And that's where those invoices are, we're going to start to put some information associated with the invoice to be able to determine where that invoice needs to go in terms of its approval. Does it need to go off to a project manager? Are there, other people involved that might need to be able to approve the invoice? And I'm saying project manager, I don't want to make an assumption here. I'm just using that from more of that construction perspective. But bear in mind, Titanium is used with Sage Intacct regardless of whether it's in the construction space or not. But once the invoices are initially entered, they get sent off to the approvers. There's a very elaborate workflow process that's built into Titanium, allowing for the ability to route invoices in a number of different ways. Once they arrive in the approver's inbox, if you will, the approver has the ability to approve the invoices not only by logging into their desktop, but they could also approve invoices on a mobile device if they want. Once the approvals are done, the invoices have been reviewed to confirm everything is good. And this is that final review step is really optional. If we feel confident that once the approver, let's say a project manager approves an invoice, that everything is good, then that invoice is going to update Sage Intacct. Once it updates Sage Intacct, all of your financials have been updated, as well as sending over the image data, which I'll show you an example of that. And then, as I mentioned, we've been able to take that workflow process to what we describe as kind of that final step, that final swing, which is those invoices have now been approved. We also can manage the payment process and release those payments through the AvidPay network. So we'll talk about that as well. The beauty of all of this is that this can all be done with tremendous efficiency, and there are opportunities for us to never have to touch a piece of paper anywhere along the way. In addition, there's a great deal of visibility that's available all along the way to be able to see everything associated with the invoice. Okay, so just to highlight quickly 3 benefits of purchase to pay automation. One of them is visibility. So when we're talking about a manual process where invoices are being sent off to approvers by hand, a lot of times, there's a lack of visibility. We don't know when we send the invoice to the approver, maybe it gets put into a folder somewhere. We don't know exactly where it happens to be and when we're going to get that invoice back. So what the system allows us to do is to be able to see things and be able to view and analyze and know exactly where things are at any given time. So that's one thing. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about visibility first. Then we're going to talk about increasing efficiency. So now we're going to get into the whole process of the workflowing, the ability to take an invoice from the time that it arrives at your door, perhaps through an email, to be able to send that invoice off to the approvers and really kind of bypass any of the manual steps. And then finally, we're going to talk about the ability to pay invoices in a very efficient manner so that we're not having to cut checks, put checks in the mail, and send them out to, via the mail. So those are the steps that we're going to go through. I'm going to go through a workflow, but I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between talking about visibility first, then we're going to go into a bit of a workflow process where we're talking about gaining efficiency, and then finally, we're going to talk about that pay process. So with that, let's go ahead and get out of the PowerPoint. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so I have already logged into Sage Intacct, and I've already logged into TimberScan Titanium. You're seeing Titanium in front of you now. Titanium is a cloud-based application, runs in a browser. So as you can see, all of the information, all of my menu items are here on the side panel. As I select anything, it brings up the various submenus underneath, and I can choose anything that I need to here. So from the ability to be able to kind of navigate through the application, very straightforward in terms of how we would go about navigation and being able to see things very quickly. And speaking of seeing things very quickly, what you'll notice is, whoops, sorry, there is a timeout process here if I don't touch the system for a period of time, and obviously I hadn't. So back in. Now let's talk about that kind of first step in the process, which is gaining visibility. So one of the areas where I'm able to gain visibility, as you can see, is right up front. As I've logged into Titanium, I'm able to see all of the users associated with the application and where things stand with regard to outstanding invoices. Remember, this is all focused on that whole invoice and AP workflow process. So right out of the gate from this dashboard, I can see, because I happen to log in from an administrative perspective, I can see everything. I can see what the total outstanding dollar amount is, what's overdue. Obviously, we've got to get a lot of things paid here. And then as I start working my way down through the dashboard widgets, I can actually break things down by vendor, by project, by task, and then further along down who it's assigned to. And then if we go even further down, we've got even more drill down functionality to show me, you know, down to the detail level of what project we're talking about, what task, what due dates are associated with this. And you'll also notice as I hover the mouse around the pie chart that it starts to display for me these tooltips that will show me, for example, who the vendors are that we have outstanding invoices with in the total dollar amount. Same thing with by project, by task, for example. So these are the types of things that I'm able to see just by looking at the dashboard on the front end. Now, let's talk a little bit more about that dashboard from this perspective. If I were a restricted access user, meaning, for example, I'm an approver, maybe I'm a project manager, and I'm not necessarily supposed to see everyone, then I would be restricted in what I would see. I would only see invoices that are associated with me and not with, for example, the entire company. But what's nice from my perspective from that administrative lens is that I can start to drill in. So I could go in here and I can look at a particular approver and I can see exactly how many invoices they have that are outstanding. Who are the key vendors that they're working with and the total dollar amount that's outstanding? What projects is Leanne working on? What tasks, you know, are key tasks is she associated with in which we've got outstanding invoices? So in this case, it gives me that lens, that visibility to be able to jump very quickly, to be able to see who has what and how long, for example, have they been holding on to it. So this gives me that scenario where I don't have to run a whole bunch of reports. I don't have to go running around the office saying, you know, where's the invoice that I sent to you last week? Everything's right here in front of me. It's right on the dashboard. And I can go into any one of these widgets and be able to see whatever information I need. So when you talk about visibility and being able to kind of manage and see things on the front end, this is an example of what we're talking about. Let's go one step further here in terms of visibility. I'm going to actually go into an invoice for a moment, and I want to just show a couple of things here, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about this invoice process here a little bit further. But if I were to go into, let's take this one as an example. Okay, another option with respect to visibility. Notice how, and I'm going to get into more detail about the data entry here as we go in through the workflow. But I talked about those tooltips when you hover the mouse on the pie chart. Those tooltips are built throughout the application. If I wanted to see details about, for example, the purchase order, notice how I just click on the little inquiry button, and it's now showing me, here's the original purchase order amount, here's what we've invoiced, here's what's currently in titanium, the balance of the, and if the balance goes negative, it highlights that for me in red. What I can also do is I could do history on this particular field or any field, for example. So if I wanted to see, for example, the history for this particular vendor, I can just click on the history button here. And now I see all of the invoices for Beaverton Sand and Gravel right here in front of me. Now, if I want to go one step further, maybe I want to go down and I want to look at a specific invoice that we processed, whenever it happened to be. Not only can I call up the invoice image, but if I click on the plus sign, it also shows me how that invoice was coded. So again, I'm not having to go out and search all over the place to dig out information about prior invoices for a particular vendor. It's all right here in front of me. It's right here on the screen, and it gives me that opportunity and that visibility, that opportunity to be able to see that information on screen. We talked about the purchase order and the commitment. We also have the ability to see that commitment summary. So from here, I can see all of the commitments that are associated. And again, when I click on the plus sign, it allows me to break this down by individual transaction. What happened and when. So again, another opportunity for me to be able to drill further in, see things in more detail, and just continue to proceed forward from there. Let's talk about a few other things with regard to visibility. So in the inquiries screen, we have a series of inquiries, and what's nice about the way the inquiries are designed is that they provide for a tremendous amount of flexibility with regard to what I want to see. If I wanted to just see transactions, for example, for a particular vendor, I could just go out, I could search the vendors, I could say, just give me all of my transactions for, I don't know, let's just say A1 Electric, for example. So we'll just choose that one. And then I'll be able to update this when I'm finished with my process here. And I'll be able to see just transactions for A1 Electric. It presents things in this kind of spreadsheet format like you see here, so that it gives me this grid to be able to see a lot of information all together if I need to. But ultimately what I could do here is I could click on this report button, and it would allow me, if I wanted to download the information that I just selected in when I built this criteria. And not only can I download and create a report, but I could also select PDF format, and I could attach the images to the report. So for the purposes of something like, for example, a substantiated billing, maybe it's a time and material project or a cost plus project where we want to be able to justify the cost, where we want to be able to send them this substantiated billing report. These are the types of things that you can create literally on the fly in a matter of seconds, be able to grab the information, create the report. And I may have an example of the report. Let me take a quick look here. Here we go. Okay, so let me just make this a little bigger so we can see it better. So gives me details about the report. This is what I created here. This literally took a matter of a couple of seconds. I got all my transactions that I needed. I could have done this for a particular time period, for example. And then once I create the report, if you notice as I start to scroll down, it also attached all of the invoice images in that selection criteria that I chose. So that just gives you the kind of example of things that I can choose if I wanted to be able to see this. Okay, let's go back. To here. So again, we're talking about visibility. Another thing that you can also do is you can set up notifications and you can set up alerts. So if, for example, I wanted to, when we send out an invoice to an approver, I want to send them a notification. I can choose when I want to do that. What I can also do is I could then set up reminders if I needed to. Notice how I've set one up called a once a week reminder. This is for any invoice that happens to be sitting in someone's queue for longer than X number of days, in this case, 5 days. So if they've had that invoice for more than 5 days, they're going to get a notification letting them know that they need to get that invoice approved. And these are the types of things that you can set up. You can create intervals and you can, send out those notifications whenever you need to. So again, we're talking visibility here. We're talking about being able to gather information very quickly, be able to see it, have it easy access, and then be able to then take action on it if we need to. One final thing we'll talk about with regard to visibility, and that is once we've processed invoices and we send them over to Sage Intacct, we not only send over the transaction detail, we also send over the images. So if I'm in Sage Intacct, I've updated AP with the process here. Maybe I've sent over this invoice for A1 Electric. Ultimately, what I could do if I needed to is I can just call up the invoice image. And I could see, the fact that invoice, I have all the information associated with the invoice here. And then one more thing with regard to visibility, for every single invoice that we process through Titanium, we also attach what's called an approval page. So the approval page is our opportunity to be able to view all of the iterations of that invoice from the time that it originally arrived and we received it to who entered it, who approved it, and who posted this over to, in this case, Sage Intacct. Okay, all right. So let's go back to here and let's talk about efficiency. So I think we've hopefully I've given you some tools, some things, some ideas to think about with regard to visibility on the front end. Now let's talk about efficiency. So I've mentioned a couple of different times that we want to be able to manage the invoice process as efficiently as we possibly can. And in doing so, what we want to be able to do is to try to process invoices without having to touch a piece of paper if we can avoid it. Because the more times that we have to handle a piece of paper, the longer it's going to take to get things done. So let's talk about a workflow scenario here. Let's start at the point where an invoice arrives at your door. And we'll talk about how we go about getting the invoices into the system. So to do that, we go into our data entry scenario here, and we choose the acquire function. Now, there are several different options with which I can choose to be able to acquire an invoice. One of the things that I can do is I can just go ahead and drag and drop. So I'm going to assign the invoice to where it needs to go first. And then if I needed to, let's hide a couple of other screens here. I could just drag and drop a document that maybe came in by email. Maybe it was something that was sitting in a file or a folder. But basically what I do is I call up that invoice onto the screen. I'm able to see all of the pages up and down, or I can use the thumbnail if I need to just go to a specific page. If a vendor happened to send me more than one invoice in a PDF, you can always separate the invoices by just right-clicking and say, I want to split. And then ultimately what I would do here is I would take the invoice and hit the acquire button, and that will acquire the invoices into my AP invoice entry queue, which is where we're going to go in a few minutes. Now, drag and drop is one option. Another option would be if you have a designated AP email address, Titanium has an email monitoring program. And the way the email monitoring program works is it's watching that designated AP email address, and it will take the attachment from the email, it will drop it into a file, and then give you the opportunity to just grab that entire batch of invoices out of the file. So you're not having to extract the invoices one at a time from email, drag and drop them one at a time. We're just going to take all those invoices and put them into a file. So then here, I could come in, open up that particular email file, and it would allow me, let's see here, let's go here. And my email file is somewhere in here. Got my invoices. But you know what we'll do? We will go back to, let's go back to desktop. Basically, I could just take any document that I wanted to here, and we could just go ahead and grab them, open them up, and then I'm able to just go ahead and do the exact same thing. So if I were in my email file, I pull up those particular invoices into the viewer, and then I'm able to acquire them and do the exact same thing that I did before. So the whole idea, the whole concept behind this is I'm not having to go out and monitor that email address. I'm able to go ahead and pull the information in automatically in a batch, acquire, and drop them into the AP invoice entry queue. Now, obviously, there may be some vendors that are going to still send their invoices in by mail. You can always put them onto a scanning device, scan them to a scan file, and then do the exact same thing. You just open up the file, you just go ahead and you grab whatever those scanned documents are, and you just pull them into the viewer, and you just open them up that way. Okay, so one other thing that we've also done is we've created what's called an auto acquire tool. So what auto acquire does is it basically says, let's bypass having to acquire invoices that come in by email altogether. So maybe I know that when I get invoices from A1 Electric, maybe they're coming in from a1electric.com into my designated AP email address. I know I'm going to automatically assign them to where they need to go in AP. If they sent me more than one invoice, there's probably something like text on the invoice that I can use to be able to separate them. And then I'm gonna use my optical character recognition tool that we built into Titanium to be able to process and put various information, excuse me, on the invoice so that I'm not having to go through and code, which is another thing that we're going to talk about with efficiency in just a moment. So we can drag and drop, we can acquire from email, we can obviously scan, but then you can also use the auto acquire, and you can, using auto acquire bypasses the acquire step altogether, pulls the information right from the email address, and then it will drop it directly into your AP invoice entry queue, which is where I'm going to go now. So what you'll notice here, there are several different queues that are available to me. When we're talking about accounts payable invoices, specifically what we're going to focus on is the purchasing entry queue and the bill entry queue. So why are there two queues? But you notice how the same number of invoices are in each one. Because when you acquire an invoice, we put them in either one of these queues. We basically put them in both. And the reason we did this is because when it comes to Sage Intacct, there are some very specific fields that are associated with purchasing and being able to match invoices to purchase orders and receivers that add additional fields to the entry screen. So we felt it would be easiest if we said, maybe we have overhead invoices that aren't going to be associated with purchase orders. Let's process them through the bill entry queue. Very simple, very easy, less fields to be able to navigate through. When it comes to purchasing, let's get very specific and let's actually select the invoices that are designed to be associated with a PO, and we will process them a little bit differently than what we normally would for just regular overhead invoices. Okay, now, one of the things you'll notice, I bring up this invoice. If you notice, some of the fields on this invoice are already highlighted with information. And you'll also notice that some of those fields have been populated already, such as, for example, somewhere here is what's called the vendor reference in Intacct vernacular, which is the invoice number, for example, invoice date. So the system uses a tool called Smart Extraction. And it goes out, it looks for certain information on the invoice that it can find. And when it finds that particular information, it will then populate the invoice entry screen automatically. And if it found a purchase order somewhere on the invoice, it was probably something that we used as a highlight here, be able to determine what the purchase order number was. It can go out and find that purchase order from Sage Intacct, and it can pull all of the line item information from the purchase order or the receiver, if you will, and drop all that information into the distribution grid for me. So Smart Extraction is a tool that highlights fields and automatically populates the grid for you. And then you can build upon that. So for example, let's say that I acquired an invoice from this particular vendor and it didn't populate the vendor code on the very first pass. So when it does that, I can go out, I can select my vendors. I can either drill into the vendor file from Sage Intacct, or I can just start typing in and it goes out and it searches the vendor file from Sage Intacct. And then I can go ahead and assign that vendor code very first time I get an invoice. But then what I'm able to do is click on this little plus sign here. And what the plus sign does is it says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and add that particular field to my profile for this particular vendor. So when I do that, it goes ahead, it says, okay, here's the coding profile. It says, okay, it's now added that particular field so that from this point forward, every time I get an invoice from this vendor, not only is it going to use Smart Extraction to highlight and retrieve certain fields on the invoice, it's also going to populate the vendor code for me. I could do the same thing with, you notice how I've got the plus sign available to me for things like transaction type and entity ID. So let's say that I know every time I get an invoice from this vendor that I want the entity ID to be, in this case, Timberline General Construction. I want the transaction type. These are going to be vendor invoices. These are the types of things that you can default so that it speeds up the process so that I'm not having to come in here and select these when I'm entering the invoice. The system just goes ahead and defaults. So it uses that combination of OCR Smart Extraction with coded profiles that then allows me to be able to quickly process the invoice, code it through, for example, what purchase order it might be associated with, allowing me to see all the information, compare the quantity, the unit cost, and what the dollar amount is, and then quickly get that invoice saved and routed and sent off to the approvers. Now, when you do reference and match an invoice to a purchase order, it also automatically attaches a copy of that purchase order to the invoice. So let's say, I've referenced a purchase order that was in Sage Intacct. It went out, it found that purchase order information, and when it did so, it also attached that PO document to the invoice. And if there hasn't been a purchase order document that was created, then Titanium will go ahead and create one for you. And it just automatically attaches to the invoice. Now, at this point, when I save and route the invoice, it's going to send it off to the approvers. And then they're going to come in, they're going to look at their invoice, which is where I'm going to go in a moment. Now, again, we talk about efficiency. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out who this invoice is going to be routed to. So what we've done in our workflow is we've created I mentioned this earlier, a very elaborate workflow process. And when I say elaborate, it can be very simple if you want it to be. But if you need to be able to, for example, route invoices to multiple approvers, maybe it's going to be based on some sort of a threshold criteria or something like that. All of those things can be taken into consideration. Maybe we'll send it to the project manager on this project, but then if it's for certain specific vendors, we want the vendor to supersede what the project is. So it's those types of things that you can set up here in your workflow rules. And you can also route on any field that's in the AP invoice entry grid. So if I said I wanted to route by project, you can route by project. I can route by converted from, by vendor, by whatever field I want to choose, I can route by that particular field. That's all set up in the routing fields scenario here. And then it just allows me to be able to go ahead and route it off to where it needs to go. A few other tools that are available to you to kind of create a little bit more efficiency and make this easier. You notice how, for example, part of the invoice is getting cut off by the data entry grid. I can move this around. If I wanted to click on the change mode button here, I can now shift this so that if I wanted to, I can have the invoice on one side of the screen. I can have my data entry grid on the other, and then I can start coding this way. If, let's say, I want to keep it like it was before, but maybe I want to take the invoice image, and let's say I want to move this off to a second screen. There's a little up arrow here. I can just take the image, move it off to the other screen. So now I've got the image on one screen. I've got my data entry grid as large or small as I need to on the other. We talked earlier about the tooltips, the commitment summary, the history. All of those things are available to me in AP invoice entry as well. I think one final note that I'll make here, all of these fields are all aligned in the exact same order, and they function the exact same way as they do in Sage Intacct. And it gives you the flexibility to be able to then make modifications as you go. So basically, we're going to start off with, you're going to have a data entry grid that would mirror the fields that you have in Sage Intacct today. But if I said, you know what, I want to change the label from project to something else, you can change it. Or I want to take project and I want to move it, and I want that to be over here next to vendor. You can just shift the screens around and save them. You can eliminate fields that you don't need, so that ultimately what I'm going to do is I'm going to have at my access the data entry functionality that I have from Sage Intacct with the flexibility of basically creating and designing my own AP invoice entry experience. Okay, so we go ahead and save and route. We send the invoices off to the approvers. They come into their workflow task queue, and they call up their invoices. So you'll notice here on the screen that there are some action buttons right on the screen. So if I happen to look at an invoice and I noticed on that invoice that this is not my invoice, it's not supposed to be something that I should be associated with, I can potentially reject it right from here. Syncing the task means that there is something that I need to do in order to execute and approve this particular invoice. So I can't just hit approve, which I could do down here in this invoice here, because on this one, then this invoice has already been coded to the point where I don't need to do anything else if I don't want to. So if I think everything looks good by just looking at this kind of quick snapshot summary, I can just go ahead and hit approve, and I've approved that invoice. If I want to go in and sync the task or look at the invoice, I can look at it this way. Now, the reason why I kind of brought it up in this format is because I wanted to try and demonstrate, and it's a little bit difficult to try and simulate this in this environment, but trying to emulate the fact that I could actually use this on any device. So I'm on my desktop, or I happen to be on my phone, I can still call up an invoice. This basically just fits to any device, and it formats properly so that I can come in here. I could say, here are my transactions. Let me see what I need to code. I'm just going to go ahead here. I'm going to start searching for and finding what project this is associated with, what task, what cost type. So I can go in and code it, do everything I need to do here. And then I still have all of my opportunities down at the bottom to be able to reject it, approve it, put it on hold. If you reject or put the invoice on hold, it's going to force you to put in a reason as to why you did that. That way, if anyone else needs to come in and they want to see what the status is, they can see why the invoice was rejected or why it was put on hold. Rejecting doesn't necessarily mean that it has to go back to where it started. You can reject back to previous approvers. It really just depends on how many people are part of that workflow, and you choose how far back you want to send. Okay, so pretty straightforward with the approvals. Approvals from anywhere basically is really kind of the key attribute here, with the ability to pretty much do whatever you need to do from an approval perspective. Once the invoices get finally approved, they get sent to Sage Intacct, and you saw I demonstrated just a little bit ago how we not only send over the data, but we also send over the documents that are associated with them. So now, what we've done at this point is we've acquired an invoice, we processed the invoice through AP, we sent it off to the approvers. We never touched a piece of paper anywhere along the way. We did everything within the system. We're able to see everything that we need to see, continue to be able to manage the invoices as necessary, and then we send it off to Sage Intacct. So now we're at that point where our financials are updated, and we're ready to go ahead and we're ready to start executing payments against those particular invoices. So when that happens, that's still going to originate in Sage Intacct. So in here, I'm still going to come into my AP system, and I'm still going to do my check run the way that I normally would, with one minor exception. When I do the check run, we've built a tool that will allow me to capture the data that you would normally send to a printer and pull that back into Titanium and be able to manage the payment from within Titanium. So we're doing this with the idea that you don't have to necessarily print this out as a check, put the check in the mail and mail it. We can do it all electronically. And basically, the Avid Pay Network manages that particular payment process. So think of Avid Exchange not only as an AP workflow organization, but also as more of a financial institution where we have, basically we're registered in every state in the United States to be able to execute payments on behalf of you for the purpose of paying vendors and subcontractors. And the way that this works is we started that process in Sage Intacct. We pulled that data back to our pay control system. And then from here, if I wanted to, I could actually use this as more of an approval process. So I could come in, I could say, well, here's what looks like a simulated payment, a check, with the check stub and the invoice that the check is paying. And when I do that, what I'm able to do is I can see all of this information. Now, it appears that what I did is my current login, I didn't give myself security access to be able to actually view the invoice image and the associated documents. Had I done so, I'd be able to see right on this in this window, basically the payment and the invoice and supporting documents that are associated with it. And then if this were a scenario where I needed to go in and view this, I'm the person that needs to approve it. I look at it, I see the invoices that it's supposed to be paying. I go, okay, let's go ahead and approve that. That releases the payments to the Avid Pay Network, and then Avid Exchange goes ahead and pays that particular vendor on your behalf. There are 3 options with which the vendor can choose to be paid. They can be paid by virtual card, they can be paid by similar to an ACH, and they could be paid by check if they said, no, we still want to be paid by check. Now, one other thing with respect to when I talk about checks, it's not an all or nothing scenario. So if I were in Sage Intacct and I wanted to actually cut some checks for whatever reason, you can still do that. It's not precluded. It's not saying you can never cut a check. But what we're saying is this would allow you to be able to take the majority of your payments that you normally would print to a check, and instead we'll take that payment, we'll capture it into Titanium, and we'll release the payment from here. And then once those payments have been released to the Pay Network, the final step in the process, and again, back to the whole where we started with visibility, I can come in here and I could see any payment and I could see the status. So I could see, for example, for A1 Electric, okay, it looks like this is a cleared payment. They were paid by virtual card. Here's the check number from Sage Intacct that we created. And oh, by the way, if I wanted to, with every single payment transaction, there's also a proof of payment document that gets associated with it and gets attached to the invoice as backup. And finally, what I can also do is I click on the plus sign, and it serves as what I refer to as kind of the UPS tracking tool. It shows me everything that takes place once this payment gets released to the Avid Pay Network, so that we can always track it and know exactly from the moment that it was released to the Avid Pay Network to when it actually became a cleared payment. Each of these transactions becomes an ACH debit in your Sage Intacct account, so that you're able to track and reconcile every one of those transactions. Okay, Megan, we have kind of completed the process, and I think we're at the point where if there's anything in the chat with regard to questions, more than happy to address or answer any of them.
Thanks, Mike. Right now, there are no questions in the chat. I would like to give everybody a chance to type in any questions if they have any. And you can always email us with any questions. You can email us at operations@accordantco.com, and I can have these questions answered for you. But at this point, there are no questions in the chat. So if not, we will conclude the webinar. Thank you again, Mike, and I hope everybody has a great day.
All right, Megan, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.